JJ Redick has been a huge gift to the mainstream media lately, as the former player has been setting basketball circles on fire with his many controversial takes. I debated whether or not I should make a video about some of JJ's comments, and for a while, I didn't think I was going to, simply because it's just one man's opinion. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that JJ is kind of becoming the face of many critical modern NBA fans. He's famously referred to pros from previous generations as plumbers and firemen, and he's a guy who's ready and willing to take shots at previous generations. Recently, NBA greats like Dominique Wilkins and Michael Cooper took offense to some of his comments, as they sent back some heated remarks. Now, I really don't have a problem with some modern players occasionally throwing some shade at past legends, because, to be honest, a lot of former players have been doing that to current players for a while now. Basically, don't dish it if you can't take it. To be honest, I don't care so much about the whole it's disrespectful angle either way, because people getting their feelings hurt doesn't dictate whether or not it's actually true. All I care about is whether or not JJ is actually right, and on this, I believe he's horribly wrong, for the most part. For those of you still wondering what JJ said to make people so upset, take a listen.
Bird is one of the great shooters in the history of the sport, not even close.
Bird shot threes. He never was a volume shooter from three.
No, I know that, but he was a great three-point shooter. He was not good. He was great. He's one of the top 5 three-point shooters of all time. That's how good Bird is. Oh, yes.
We're not
three-point shooting contests. He was phenomenal. Bird's a great shooter.
Wait a minute, Doggy.
And Bird didn't shoot.
Bird is absolutely one of the greatest
Doggy.
shooters ever, but he's not one of the top 5 three-point, top 3, whatever
Did you see the three-point shooting that he put on, those clinics that he put on at the All-Star game?
Again,
did you watch?
Doggy, it's just math. It's attempts, it's makes, and it's percentage. And there's no way you could ever argue Larry Bird is a top 3 three-point shooter of all time. You can't make that argument.
You're basing it on math. You're basing it on math and a time of when he played. I'm basing it on just shooting. Bird is a unbelievable.
Again, we had this discussion the other day. About James Naismith. James Naismith invented the game. You were rewarded for putting the ball in the basket. There's plenty of people that have shot more, made more, and guess what? Made more at a higher percentage than Larry Bird from 3. I'm not saying Larry Bird is not one of the greatest shooters ever. He's not one of the greatest three-point shooters ever.
Yes,
you cannot make that argument.
Yes, I'm sorry. Because the 80s was so much different. There's physicality, the way they guarded people. You couldn't. Can we get off
I've been trying to make a point.
Seriously,
I've been trying to make a point for you, Doggy.
Come on, man.
I've been trying to
First off, I'm not vibing with Mr. Super Celtic fan over here either, who seems to overly inflate every Celtics great who's ever played, whether it be Larry Bird, Bob Cousy, or whoever. But back to the point. In that clip you just witnessed, JJ criticizes Larry Bird's shooting prowess. He attempted to discredit great shooters from previous generations, and he challenged the legitimacy of that physical era. Let me first start by tackling his mockery of the physicality narrative. In numerous interviews, on ESPN, and on his podcast, Redick has tried to make the point that the physicality of the game was not that different back then compared to today's game. I'll start by saying this. When Larry Bird played in the 80s, the flagrant foul did not exist yet in the NBA. I repeat, when Larry Bird played in the 80s, the flagrant foul did not exist yet in the NBA. That alone should tell you that players back then were able to get away with things that they can't get away with today. I mentioned this recently in my YouTube short. But Bill Laimbeer is seen by many people as the dirtiest player of all time, yet he has the 5th longest streak of games played in NBA history with a total of 685. He did this to Larry Bird and was never suspended. He also did this, and this, yet was never suspended or even ejected. And again, those are the things that he just did to Larry Bird. On top of the fact that you could just clobber guys, the defensive 3-second violation wasn't introduced to the NBA until the early 2000s, which means that throughout the 80s, big men could simply camp under the basket and cause physical punishment to any player who tried to drive the lane. Not only is the flagrant foul now limiting that physicality, but now centers and power forwards are often away from the paint due to the 3-second violation, which equals more contact-free layups and dunks. The league is simply not like it used to be in terms of its physically punishing style. And honestly, I would hear someone out if they said that that was actually a good thing. But come on, JJ, let's not act like the league hasn't drastically changed from its physically punishing ways. Not every game was an absolute bloodbath in the 80s, and if some older gentleman told you that, well, he was lying. It often depended on which teams were involved, and if the teams wanted to set a physical tone for the game. For example, the Showtime Lakers hated playing that way, as their roster preferred more finesse and a quicker style of play. The thing is, when they ran into the Celtics and Pistons, they often didn't have a choice, as those teams wanted to establish a more physical game, and back then, they could do that. Now, the other thing JJ talked about was three-point shooting, saying that Larry wasn't a top 5 three-point shooter of all time. And honestly, that's actually a decent take, because it's pretty darn stacked at the top of the list, with guys like Steph Curry, Ray Allen, Reggie Miller, Klay Thompson, Damian Lillard, Craig Hodges, and so on. But going as far as saying that Larry isn't one of the greatest three-point shooters ever is just simply ludicrous. As far as I'm concerned, Larry is in the top 10, 15, or 20. Any one of those spots would qualify him as one of the greatest shooters of all time. He's tied for the most three-point competitions won in NBA history, and when adjusted for the changes in the rules, his final rounds are pretty similar to the recent final rounds in NBA three-point contest history.
Did you watch? Doggy, it's just math. It's attempts, it's makes, and it's percentage.
JJ's comments seem to suggest that Larry wasn't a very efficient three-point shooter, but that's not even the case. For his career, Larry shot 37.6% from three-point distance, which is an even greater percentage than Damian Lillard's, who now many people are putting in the conversation of the greatest shooters of all time. Larry was also much better from three-point range in the second half of his career over the first. The reason for this is because Larry's rookie season in the NBA was also the year the league introduced the three-point shot, which was 1979. This means that Bird wasn't practicing the three ball throughout his years in high school and college. Instead, he literally developed his three-point shot during his years in the NBA, and he hadn't mastered it until the mid-80s, which drastically affected his career percentages. On top of that, Bird was an even better shooter when it mattered the most, as he shot 42.2% from three-point range over his career in the NBA Finals. That finals percentage is greater than the finals efficiency of both Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. But one of JJ's biggest angles was the topic of volume.
It's attempts, it's makes, and it's percentage.
I'm gonna be frank, this is an absurd criticism to make against Bird, and it literally unfairly critiques every player before the 2010s. JJ basically states that you need to shoot a relatively high volume of threes compared to today's game. The problem is, based on that logic, no one who played outside of the last 5 seasons of NBA history has an argument for being one of the greatest three-point shooters ever. 76 years of NBA history, but apparently only the last 5 count. That is insanely biased and short-sighted. Of course, shooters like Larry Bird, Reggie Miller, and Ray Allen would love to play in this modern NBA where more three-pointers are attempted. And holding the fact that they didn't against them is simply an absurd standard. Also, saying that Bird wasn't a volume shooter is a claim that you can only make if you're comparing him to modern basketball, because back in his era, he was a volume three-point shooter. For 6 straight seasons, Bird finished in the top 10 spots for the most three-point attempts per game. And in back-to-back seasons, he finished in the number 1 spot for three-pointers attempted per game. In those 2 seasons, Bird shot 42.3% and 40% from distance. Larry Bird was one of the greatest three-point shooters of all time, and the game was more physical in the 80s. Now, I already know what's coming. For those of you saying, I'll listen to the NBA player instead of the YouTuber. Well, that point is irrelevant, because there are many other NBA players who disagree with Redick. So just because he's the pro doesn't automatically give him the correct opinion. And by that same logic that I can't give a valid opinion on NBA players because I never was one, then JJ Redick can't give a valid opinion on NBA superstars because he never was one.